Welcome to Founders Unplugged, hosted by Greg McCallum. Long-form, honest conversations with founders and entrepreneurs from around the world.
Hey Greg, I'm Jordan. I am a serial founder. I've spent the vast majority of my career as a founder and CEO of predominantly tech businesses, although weirdly I've also done a few, I've done a hardware business, and I've also built a big professional services or consulting business, which I sold to Bain. But basically been a founder. And then after one lucky exit, having made a bit of money, transitioned over to the investment side of things, predominantly as an angel, just putting small tickets into a bunch of startups here in the UK and across Europe. And then I sort of parlayed that experience into a professional role in VC. So I then went to be a venture partner at a company called Vector, which was a sort of $200 million global early stage VC fund. Found the role of being a capital allocator and investor quite boring. Not my cup of tea, lots of watching and waiting. And that's kind of when I realized I'm really an operator and I prefer to be building than just deploying checks. So got out of VC, and then took a year off, sort of sabbatical in academia, teaching entrepreneurship at an MBA level at Oxford, but also an MSc level at UCL, and lots of extracurricular stuff. So I accelerated programs around the world just for fun and games, giving back to sort of early stage founders. And then in that process, that's where I became obsessed, or where I stumbled across and then latterly became obsessed with startup studios or venture builders. And so that's where I came across a guy called John Borthwick, who still runs a company, it's been a while now, called BetaWorks in New York. And when I stumbled across this whole concept of being a startup studio, so an entity that sort of acts as a co-founder to a portfolio of startups or companies, I was like, that seems to be freaking awesome. And on paper, it was like, wow, this sort of ticks all the boxes in terms of it has the best bits of being a founder, where often you're doing the ideation, you're coming up with the ideas you want to build, and you're very hands-on, and you have real ownership stakes, you have real control, you're busy doing the execution in the early stages. But at the same time, you kind of got the best bits of the investing side, which is you can raise LPs money, you can leverage your wealth versus others, you can deploy money across a portfolio. You're not just limited to like, all my eggs are in this basket, and if the startup fails or succeed, it's sort of a additional outcome for me. And so got obsessed with those company builder type models, set up one in London called Corner Shop with 3 other guys, and had a crack at it. Realized it was a lot harder than you might think. And ultimately that studio ended up sort of collapsing on our most successful venture, which was this one venture which basically ended up spinning out, raising, at the time, quite a decent seed round for the venture. And then my 3 co-founders sort of fell in to be the founders of that startup, right? So we sort of, instead of building this factory of sort of, startup after startup coming off the production line, we ended up basically kind of shooting off one rocket, and that was the scaffolding fell away. It was in the ad tech space, which I wasn't that passionate about. So I ended up not going with them, and sort of basically they ran with it. And that's when I then joined Rainmaking, which was a company builder with a very different model, started way before us. They started in 2007. And I basically bought my way into being a late co-founder in Rainmaking. And that's where I spent the last 10 years. So at Rainmaking, over the last 10 years, we built, between the 6 co-founders, about 15 to 18 odd ventures. It's probably about 11 that are still running today. And in that model, which was very different to the types of models you would normally associate with a startup studio, Rainmaking was basically a collective of serial entrepreneurs. So their model was kind of unique in the sense, or just different in the sense that when the original founders were basically becoming parents for the first time, they were like, whoa, how do I justify the responsibilities of parenthood with my desire to do another startup that will probably fail? It's like, oh, how do I look my partner in the eye and be like, this is good for us as a family? And so their solution was to basically set up Rainmaking, whereby I think they started off with 4 initially, but the original founders would basically each build their own startup, and their ownership in that startup wouldn't be owned by them, would be owned by a common holdco. So it meant that, if one of them got success and the other 3 failed, they would all share in the success of that one. So it was this piece of like basically building in a portfolio of startups across these individuals. And I actually met Rainmaking when I was doing Corner Shop, my previous startup studio, because they were more advanced, and I went to Copenhagen, they're based in Denmark, and spent a day with them just being like, how do you do this? Like, how do you allocate resources? When do you kill stuff? Like, how do you do the ideation? All of the common questions you need to answer when you're doing a startup studio. So join them. And over the last 10 years, I built 3 companies within my tenure. So I did a lot of work with Startup Bootcamp, which was our startup accelerator program initially, where we've now invested in something like 1,800 startups globally through that accelerator network. Then I accidentally built Rainmaking Innovation, which was the consulting business, which was corporate innovation consulting. Grew that to about 250 FTEs across 4 regions, so UK, Europe, Middle East, and Asia. We sold the Asia division to Bain in 23. And then I set up a separate company called RVS, which is an acronym for Rainmaking Venture Studio. Not great on the names. And that was really an investment vehicle that focused on building startups from scratch in partnership with large corporates, but not within the constraints of a professional services model. So we never charged the corporates any fees. We would co-invest millions of our own cash alongside the corporate, but it was basically us, the corporates, and the founders. We would then recruit the CEO, CTO pair into those ventures, and we'd basically build startups from scratch, where 2 things were the primary driver for that. One was we really believed, or we tried to get a better outcome, a better success rate in building these startups by leveraging the scale strengths the corporates had. So we were designing startups specifically to plug into their distribution, so millions of customers, their their logistics fleet, so their warehouse network, their trucks fleet, or whatever it may be. Could be their regulatory license and say financial services or insurance. And then 2 would try and bake in the buyer, aka the corporate, from day one. And so the explicit agreement was, if the startup was successful 4 or 5 years down the line, we'd basically sell it back to the corporate. And then us and the founders would make our money that way. So those were the 3 main ventures that I sort of built within my tenure at Rainmaking. But my co-founders built a bunch of other stuff, a couple of e-com brands. We've got a marketplace in North America that sells new and used shipping containers. We built an insurtech business in the Nordics. It's weird and wonderful of just how varied what kind of ended up being under the umbrella. An influencer marketing platform called Takumi, a whole variety of different things. So that sort of takes me up to today. And then I personally left Rainmaking in basically June last year. So no longer operational on a day-to-day basis at Rainmaking, still a director, still a shareholder. But I'm kind of now back into the wild, trying to figure out what I want to be when I grow up.
Yeah, well, let me know when you figured it out, because I think we're all trying to do that too. Yeah, I mean, look, it's such a massively varied and interesting journey you've had, which is one of the many reasons why I wanted to get you on. So thank you, and it's great to have you on. We were just saying before we clicked record, it's been a bit of a feat to try and manage it, but we did it.
Thanks,
we got there in the end. So you're not really involved in RVS either, then, I suppose, because that's very much part of
no.
Rainmaking.
So I mean, happy to go into it. So basically, the short answer is failed to raise fund 2 for RVS in. Basically, we stopped trying to raise back into 23.
Right.
So let me get my dates right. Back into 23, yeah. And then we had a portfolio venture that was sort of mature. We were expecting to exit that in either 25, 26. And so the plan was basically like, okay, we'll just sit tight. We'll manage our portfolio companies, wait till we get an exit. And there was part of the reason where the macroeconomics for raising a fund had seriously deteriorated in the back end of 23. But also we had this one venture that was sort of like a year or 2 away from exiting. And so basically LPs were like, well, why don't you just wait for that to exit and then like talk to us then? Because, you're a bit too close to the finish line. And it's kind of understandable actually in hindsight of just like waiting for that on paper return to be crystallized and banked. And that would have actually enabled us to seed Fund 2 properly with our own capital. And I think that would have changed the dynamics for Fund 2. But also in the process, in hindsight, actually quite glad I didn't raise Fund 2, because in 24 basically transpired that the model doesn't really work.
What you mean, in general, or your particular model?
No, so our model. So specifically
Right.
building with corporates in the way we were building it.
Right.
It's I mean, I can go down that rabbit hole if you like. It's
yeah, I'm curious to know what is it about that I mean, would it not have been adjustable?
You know, when we first started RVS, the stuff that I was really worried about was things like, you know, the ideation process was on us. So I was like, look, you know, can we, given the constraints that are always going to be given to us by a corporate, right? So their strategic remit, what assets and scale strengths could we leverage, genuinely access to build a startup around, and could we come up with not just good but great startup ideas and do that consistently, where we're launching, you know, 4 to 6 ventures a year. So there's a piece I was like, look, can we do that consistently, you know, at sort of, I wouldn't say at scale, but at sufficient quality and quantity. And the second thing I was like, oh my God, the number one driver of investment returns is going to be like the quality of the founders that we recruit. So can we genuinely get the best CEOs and CTOs, you know, for that venture at that time to accept the deal and like kind of recruit them? And moreover, can we de-risk the sort of arranged marriage effect if we're having to pair a CEO and CTO together who've no prior working experience or relationship? And you know, can we get that right? And then it was like, God, can we get corporates to even accept our legal terms? Because there were so many things that were like non-negotiables for us around like cap table, around the fact that they don't have control. You know, the founders need to get their deal right. And can we get them to explain these things, right? And then ultimately, I was like, yeah, those are the 3 things I'm really worried about. Obviously, before we started RVS, the one that I was equally worried about was like, can we even raise money to do this in the first place? Because it's a business model that doesn't generate any revenue. So you need to raise 2 lots of capital. You need to raise the OPEX to run the studio, which is like in the early days, maybe $1 million, and then later days, maybe like 3 million a year burn rate. And you need to get the burn covered until you reach first exit. So is that a 5 or a 6 year window you need to basically cover OPEX? And then latterly, you then need the co-investment capital to deploy alongside the corporates when they're pumping in $1 million. Are we pumping in 500K? Are we pumping in $1 million? And how do you do that after multiple rounds per venture? So can we get basically on average something like 3 to 5 million per venture to invest? Now, some ventures will die in the first year or 2, so you deploy less capital, but can we raise those 2 chunks of capital? Those are the things I was really obsessed with. I wasn't really worried about the portfolio management, which would be the final piece, which is once you've created these ventures, obviously you sit on the board and can you allocate? Can you be really helpful and can you be hands-on and can you do those things well, like the portfolio management side? I wasn't worried about that. But the former 4 I was, and in reality, kind of nailed all of those. So it was like, you know, got the ideation stuff sorted, got amazing founder talent in. I mean, there was a few mistakes, fairness, like 1 or 2 individuals, but like broadly, I think we got great talent in for those ventures. And like, you know, they were all second time founders. They'd raised Series A before from tier 1 VCs. It was kind of like, it was a real privilege to work with them. Can we get corporates to accept our legal agreements? Yes. I mean, we got better at that over time. And the more deals we did, the more nuanced our legal agreements became and sophisticated. Basically, always trying to protect us in the venture from the corporate craziness, which sort of exists. And so we did all of these things. We got really quite efficient and effective at doing all of the hard things that I was worried about. But ultimately, the reason why it didn't work was for none of those. And it was for things we'd never really foresaw, which was...
Hi, a friendly reminder to share this episode with your network, like, and subscribe. And if you are feeling really supportive, please consider reviewing the show on the podcast platform of your choice. It all really helps support what we do. Thank you. Now back to the show.
The fact that, you know, corporates were getting equity, they were investing millions alongside us. So for me, it's like, well, they own equity, they've got skin in the game, we've got skin in the game. Our incentives are 100% aligned. So, you know, we either win together or we lose together. I'm like, boom, no problem. The issue is, hindsight, I can now tell you with certainty that corporates do not behave as rational economic investors. or economically rational investors. You're building this business and they might have sunk, in some cases, like 20 million euros into it. And it's doing super well, like 120 employees, about 40 million of ARR, doubling year, like 100% year, like 110% year-on-year growth by like year 5, like basically a unicorn waiting. And then a new group CEO comes in and goes, yeah, I think this is a distraction. Let's shut it down. And you're like, what?
Wow.
Like, that is the definition of success right there. Yeah, well, like, just don't have the feels for it right now. Or, the way that would sort of manifest would basically be you'd have probably on average something like 2 to 3 champions that love what you're doing. They would get a new boss, and the new boss was like not interested in this venture building stuff. And lo and behold, they'd be like, well, my boss is not interested in it. And guess what? I care about my bonus and my prospects a lot more than this thing. It wasn't my money, so hasta luego. So the truth is, we saw them time and time again make decisions around either investment rounds, like no-brainer investments. They'll be like, no, we're out. Or this thing's like killing it, like just buy it, or like we're on the road to recovery. And they'd be like, nah, we're not interested. And so you just could not trust them to make economically rational decisions. But also what we kind of learned the hard way was all of these legal agreements we had in place, kind of pointless, in the sense that if the corporate doesn't want to honor the agreement, they basically go, yeah, we're not honoring it. And you go, well, I've got this legal agreement. And they're like, what are you going to do? And you're like, what? And they're like, yeah, I'm Unilever. Unilever, but it's like, I'm a Fortune 500. Good luck. Yeah. And you suddenly realize it's like, what? You're being a dick. And they're like, yeah. Don't. And
they're playing a different game.
Yeah, basically. You just sort of realized, like, actually, we weren't big enough to hold them accountable on anything, right? Which was, in practical terms, we did not have the money to truly litigate. Even if we did litigate and we win, 3 or 4 years later, what would we be getting? Meanwhile, venture long dead. But also, not even from like a reputational standpoint or a credibility standpoint, they're like, oh no, I've annoyed Jordan and 3 other people at Rainmaking. We'll never work with them again. Who cares? Like, we're just not, they can't do this to their peers, but we're not a peer, right? They couldn't turn around and treat us the way they treat someone they care about, even a McKinsey, because a McKinsey would be like, so do you ever want to use McKinsey again? Because you treat us like this. But also McKinsey, is a multi-billion-dollar company. You can hold them accountable a bit more, right? And so we didn't even have the gravitas of like, who would I care that I've upset? Like on a human level. It's like, no one there's that important to like my Fortune 500 business.
Yeah.
And so the truth is all the legal agreements we had were kind of pointless. And we had a few scenarios where they basically just told us to like jog on. And we just got left holding the bag.
No, that sucks.
And then I'd say the final thing is the fundamental thing we bet our house on that model was, why are we working with corporates in the first place? Because they're a pain in the ass. There's a lot of complexity. They're super slow. It's not about the money, especially prior to like 2024. Like we lived in a world of like an abundance of capital. There's an insane amount of VC capital available. It's not about I need their money at all. It's actually the money is somewhat irrelevant. It's about I want to access their scale strengths, because the whole investment thesis from our point of view was like, oh my God, if we can tap into their millions of customers or all of these like manufacturing capabilities or whatever it may be, that is an unfair advantage. It's a bit like saying, how do you get the best of startup world with the best of like Fortune 500? And it's like startup founders, startup culture, startup tech, boom, just to get to play with all of their tools. It's like I get to like play with their toys. And that was really what we were going for. And so there's this weird thing that in order to build businesses that truly leverage those, the corporate was like, because I was like, you need to contract. I'm going to sign contracts. Well, you basically have to give me an SLA to deliver those things to this venture. And if you don't, I'll dilute you to fuck, which is basically what we did. So it was like, the only reason why I'm talking to you is because you have these things. You need to give these things to this venture. The venture was designed specifically around those things. And suddenly the corporate goes, yeah, but to give, a new co that I do not completely control or do not completely own intimate access to, let's say, my customer base, I need to have some safeguards in place. And so inevitably they asked very, like, to be fair, like, rational requests about, hey, so, you can't shop this to any of our competitors without our prior approval. You can't raise external money without our prior approval. And so they became very sort of married in the sense that the venture was very dependent on the corporate. And we used to talk about this, our investment committees, in the sense that, you would take a potential proposition to the investment committee, and our investment committee would say, look, how portable is it? I.e., if we had to like cut the umbilical cord from the corporate, like how able is this startup just to survive by itself in the wild? And there's this weird piece, which is the startups that were really portable basically had no reason for to work with a corporate. You know what I mean? It was like, well, they don't really use anything from the corporate, therefore, why are we doing it? And so we ended up building a portfolio that was like heavily, like not portable, but heavily skewed to be this tight, symbiosis with the corporate. And so what that meant was, you tied them to these things, and any whipsaw from the corporate would basically just kill the venture, even unintentionally. So if they did like a restructuring, or they did like a big acquisition or a big divestment, or they had a major new strategy overhaul, any one of those things that would then ripple through the parent organization would basically be like the sort of meteoric event that killed the dinosaurs. It would just extinct our venture, regardless to the performance of the venture itself. So yeah, so in conclusion, we kind of learned the hard way, and annoyingly, it took us many years to learn, because we were having huge success. Well, we're having successes. There were startups that did not work out along the way, and right until the end, I was very optimistic and adamant that I was going to make a shit ton of wealth and deliver a huge impact on the world via this kind of novel method of kind of getting the best of both worlds. And then the naivety gets shone when you have like contract being reneged, or like totally irrational economic decisions being made by the corporate partner, which is like, well, hold on. Like, why would you want to waste that amount of enterprise value? Yeah, just not interested. Like, because the truth is, if you think about it, Craig, the average tenure of a CEO at a publicly listed entity, like a Fortune 500, is like 4.5 years. So weirdly, what we ended up kind of realizing the hard way was, there's like a fundamental mismatch between time frames. So like we need basically a clear run from incorporation through to an exit event, probably of 5 years. Like 5 years, corporate doesn't do any like crazy shit like sell a major division, like buy, do a huge multi-billion-dollar acquisition, doesn't get a new group CEO, like, basically like all of these extinction events. If as long as they give us a clear run, we could probably get from root to fruit and exit and make our money. But it's more likely than not, actually, in that 5-year period,
one of those
things will happen. Yeah. And regardless of how successful the actual venture is performing, game over.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a shame, because it is such a, I mean, the model has such huge potential. Obviously, that's why you guys did it. But it's funny, as you were explaining initially what that was and what this particular sort of studio was all about, that was a question that was starting to bubble away in my mind, is what about that, what about this sort of that alignment piece, because and the problems that it can cause with being so reliant on a corporate in that sort of symbiotic over reliance thing. That was my immediate question I was going to ask, and you obviously got to it before I needed to. But it's such a shame. It's such a shame there's not an alignment there. But there is. It's crazy, because I speak to a lot of founders.
It's only 5 years of my life.
Well, look, I mean, you gave it a good college try.
Yeah, exactly.
But I'm assuming that there was an enormous amount achieved and learned along the way. So I mean, it's never a bad thing. But yeah, it's just interesting, because if I speak to a lot of founders, as I'm sure you do too, and there's a lot of them that are at the stage of wanting to sell to corporates and need to learn that as a skill, and it is an enormously complex thing to navigate. It's not the same. We are not the same breed of people. A corporate CEO versus a startup CEO are very much different breeds. Which is why again and again you also see that those that have to make that transition themselves because of an acquisition, an exit, IPO, whatever it might be, often don't manage it, because you're usually either one or the other. They're two very different games, two very different mindsets, and one is generally political, really, over the other. Really, these are almost positions of political power, not business. Do you know what I mean?
They're just very different things. They're just very different things. It's like it's like, actually, it's one of those areas where, when I was running Rainmaking Innovation, our corporate innovation consulting business, towards the end, when we put in new management in place, that's now CEOs running it for different regions. One of them was asking me, he was like, what new products or services do you think we should be doing in corporate innovation? And I was like, look, the one thing that I think has been the white space that no one's really tackled, but is a huge economic opportunity, is post-acquisition integration, i.e., you'd see corporates gobble up a bunch of startups, right? Or scale-ups, right? They can still be massive. And the truth is, when I look at M&A, I think there are two types of M&A. I think there's like what I would call traditional M&A, which is essentially, a PwC buying a smaller version of themselves. It's like, we're going to buy a small accountancy firm. We know exactly how to run an accountancy firm. We're going to just ingest this one that's got 200 people, and we're going to suck it all in, and it's going to work well. And that sort of approach of basically buying smaller versions of yourself as an inorganic way to grow your business, proven that works really well. Like, you can scale super quickly doing that. And loads of PE funds do the buy and build strategy, right? No problem. But when you're buying with an innovation agenda, it's a totally different thing, right? If you're buying a new to you business model, if you're buying a new technology, right, per se, which is essentially, those are the two predominant reasons why like corporates buy startups. In some cases, they buy the startups because they've got customer bases, but those sort of like Instagram or acquisitions are quite rare. So the vast majority fall into an innovation agenda. And those are a car crash by definition, right? Because in that scenario, you're buying a company that has a totally different culture to you, different processes, different people, it's a different business. Like, you have no idea how to run that business model. Like, you go from like being a product business to buying a marketplace. You're like, well, how the fuck do you run a marketplace? Well, no idea, right? You go from being a B2B business to buying a direct to, D2C consumer e-com brand. No idea how to run that. Totally different skill sets, totally different KPIs. And like, all of those are basically a train wreck. Doesn't mean the strategy was wrong. It just means that like, you go and you spend the money, but you don't know how to integrate what you've bought, and you don't know how to get the synergies from what you bought and to reap the strategic benefit of why you bought it in the first place. And I think that whole area of how do you intelligently kind of leave alone where it's appropriate versus integrate where it's appropriate, the people, the culture, the process, the technology, and so on, so that you actually achieve the overall like 36,000 foot view strategic rationale of the acquisition. I've not seen anyone do this well, but obviously this, there's a lot of acquisitions that fall into that space, and often at nosebleed valuations that get bought, and it's just like basically money wasted and shareholder value destroyed.
Yeah, that's a you don't know what you don't know scenario, right? Sorry to interrupt this conversation, but I have a quick message. So one of the biggest challenges I hear from founders, product leaders, and fast-scaling startups quite consistently is that they have a vision for the product, but they can't just build it fast enough. Hiring engineers takes a very long time, managing an in-house team can be very expensive, and working with agencies can lead to less than desirable results a lot of the time. So a lot of the startups, best startups in the world, are currently partnering with today's sponsor, AppUnite. They're not just another dev shop, they're a product development powerhouse. Their team embeds with yours, defines how their work can positively impact your product or business metrics, and build high-performing apps that scale. Whether it's in fintech, health tech, or SaaS, they don't just write code, they co-create products that grow businesses. So if you're an early stage startup and you're tired of the delays, the bad code, or agencies that just don't get it, check out appunite.com/grow, or use the QR code on screen and you can book a chat with them, tell them we sent you, and they'll look after you and set you on the right path. That's appunite.com/grow, or scan the QR code on screen and they should be able to help you out. And thank you, AppUnite, for sponsoring today's episode. Let's get back to it. It would take someone with a high degree of insight there but you're absolutely right. It's very green pastures. I mean, one area of that I'm quite passionate about, and I've worked with a few people on, not much, but on the odd occasion, is the founder journey there. really interests me, and I think there's definitely not enough being done in the lead up to an acquisition or some sort of
Yeah.
exit event, in preparing them for what can occur from a career standpoint, from a from so many, very specifically to their journey, or even the founding team at large, and what that means for them, because of that. It's one that you see time and time again. You hear the story of acquisition takes place and they're no longer the right fit for the business. And that feels crazy to me. It's like, if some of these acquisitions can take months, years to occur, surely there are things that can be put into place in order to make that transition effective. And yeah, look, it's not always the case that they're saying it for that real reason. There are other reasons there as well. But when it is that, then surely there's more that can be done to support those individuals and prepare them for that kind of scenario, so that they can be a good fit and continue to run that organization moving forward in one form or another.
They could do. I think, don't get me wrong, there are a bunch of cases where the buyer has no intent for the founders or the existing management team to stay in place. And there's also the reality of just the human nature. If you've paid someone an insane amount of money, what are the incentives for them? Even if there are earn-outs or retain-outs. And I know founders myself who have just basically done an acquisition, spent about 9 or 10 months post-acquisition, and then gone, I'm out.
Yeah.
And then they're giving up, tens of millions of earn-out. But they're like, do you know what? I made 50 million on the first chunk. Yeah. I'm good. I don't the extra.
And 10, it could be like, I've been working on this for 10 years. I'm done. Like, I get it. Yeah, absolutely.
But also there's a thing of like, if you've spent, like you say, the last 10 years or 15 years being the founder and the CEO, or just the CEO of that business, to then walk in and no longer be in, like, quote unquote, in charge or have the autonomy, and now you're reporting to someone else, you're like, no, I'm good. I'm out.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. But I think there are just some of those odd edge cases where not enough's being done.
Yeah, I mean, let's be honest as well. Like, this is the one thing which I think people don't talk about nearly enough, is the fact that the founder journey, even pre-acquisition, right? So most startups don't make it to an acquisition. Most startups don't make it to an IPO, right? But if you think about it from the founder journey, the sort of the likelihood that you would be the founder CEO that ends up still being the CEO post-IPO, like a Mark Zuckerberg, is just infinitesimally small.
Yeah.
And when you look at the data, the vast majority of founders are probably good for the first 4 or 5 years. Sometimes they stretch out to 7, depending how good their execution is, but it's more common than not that investors and management basically put in new leaders and new management, like post Series A, post Series B, post Series C for sure. What got you to be successful, to go from like 0 to 1, 1 to 100, 100 to 1,000, is not what it's going to take you to get to where you want to be when you're a 30 mil rev business trying to get to 100.
It's an entirely different skill set, mindset.
You're playing a different game, and it's a different skill set, and very few people ever make that transition, and they don't have that skill set, right? So it is understandably more common than not to have the right jockey for the right person for the right role, and that often means transitioning the founder into either completely out of the business or into like creative roles, like executive chairman, where like their ego is stroked but they're still not actually doing anything,
right?
That sort of thing.
That's absolutely right, and that's a journey that interests me, just all that whole thing, because of I see it happen in real time with founders that I know, and they start entering that phase and they start to feel a little bit a little bit under the water, and you can see the writing on the wall, and it's like, well, what's been done to prepare you for that? Like, what can you do to prepare for that? Like, there's
so the best, I think that there are two types. I think I'd say 3 types. I'm being really simplistic. They're the ones that really want to and start upskilling themselves and start getting themselves coaches and mentors, like honestly in advance, to realize that they're going to need to learn an insane amount of new skills to transition into a new leadership role as the business conforms, right? As it goes from like infant to like toddler to, teenager, right, to adult. It's like, it requires a different type of parenting, to extend the metaphor. And those ones will invest in themselves, like the hours, the money, the time, and the people to kind of try to do that transition. And it will need support from a bunch of people outside of them. They can't just do it by themselves. So like, in the US, I see a lot more founders have CEO coaches, which weirdly I don't see much of here. But anyway, so that's like typology one, the one that potentially becomes the Mark Zuckerberg. Two is like the ones which are like, do you know what? They have grace about knowing what they're good at and what gives them energy and where they sit within that role. It's like, cool, I've got it to 20 mil. This is where I max out. I'm now no longer the best person to lead this company. And they've got a succession plan in place, and they actively communicate this in advance to their shareholders, their investors, their board, and they've transitioned themselves out smoothly, and they gracefully bow out off the stage, right? And the third is the one that has no grace, is completely ignorant, wants to stay on, and has to be kicked out.
Yeah, absolutely. It all just comes down to overall ambition and state of ego, I guess, as to where they end up landing.
See, I'm glad you mentioned ego, because the truth is, it's like what matters the most important thing, and it's really hard for founders, and I get it, and I've been here as well, to separate the business from themselves.
Yeah.
Because it is our baby. So much of our identity, so much of our self-worth, so much of our net worth, so much of our like everything. The relationships we've given up, the sacrifices we made for the business are tied into that business, right? And so there's this real kind of, where does the human begin and where does the business end? It's like they're all just one, right? And I get that. But the piece here is you've always got to ask yourself, what's in the best interest of the business?
Yeah.
And
that's why the analogy of a child is so good, because I've used it a lot of times on the show, because it's at some point you have to let them go off to college. You have to let them
100%.
move out. Yeah.
100%. And then what's the best for me?
Right.
Because there's another piece of like, you still need to look after yourself, right? And there's things which I don't believe in hustle culture, which is like, if your health goes out the window, or your mental health goes out the window, or, all of these things, you're not getting your sleep, you're boozing too much, you're working too hard. Like, this is all going to reduce your ability to perform as a human being for that. And as you get older, I do think the question of like, what kind of parent do I want to be? What kind of husband or, wife do I want to be? I think those are really important to get right, because if you're unhappy here, you're still going to suck, in the business, right? So you've got to look at it holistically. But I do think they're two separate questions: what's right for the business and what's right for me. And you've always got to put the business first, because that's the entity that should go on and should, one of the greatest achievements I think of being an entrepreneur is to build an organization that outlives you.
Yeah.
Right. The job of a CEO is to build an organization that delivers on the vision, not to be the one that does all of it.
Yeah, and it shouldn't be reliant on you in order to achieve its
100%.
goals.
And so if you haven't built a business that survives your bowing out, like, let's take this to an extreme, which is probably unpleasant, but like, you got hit by a bus tomorrow, what happens to the business? If the business didn't survive you, well, I don't think you've done a great job as a founder.
Yeah.
Especially if the business has got some level of maturity in it, some level of size.
Which is a bitter pill to swallow, because we all want to feel that we're needed and necessary in the things that we do and in our lives. But that is I think that's a much more mature approach. But I mean, it's something that I take a lot. I learn a lot of lessons from with some of the mentoring work I do with local business owners. So I do quite a lot of stuff, mostly in the startup world, but I also do some voluntary pro bono stuff in the local community with people who ex-offenders who want to start a business, or just local people who they've got families and stuff, and they want to create their own they want to become self-employed or whatever it is. And that is one thing that comes up time and time again is you see people who cutting hair or doing nails or bricklaying or whatever, and it's like, okay, cool. Why do you want to do this? What's the ultimate vision? Because it's one thing to just go to work every day and you be the main service provider, you be the product. But it's another thing to start thinking a bit further, a bit more strategically, like how can you do this in a way which means you're building something of an empire, something that can work while, because you can't stand on your feet all day, every day until you retire. You can't do backbreaking work every day until you die. Like there has to be some longevity in that. So, this is true on both ends of these kinds of businesses, whether it's in venture in the startup world or whether it's by yourself. We need to think about that, even just from a practical perspective of like, do you really want to be doing this until the day you die? Like, do you? Like, no. Well, you want to spend time with the family. You want to have some money in the bank,
I think there's a piece where I think as long as it's a conscious choice, there's only the right answer for them. Right?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
So for me on that scenario, it's a case of, look, you can be a self-employed individual, or basically, a solo freelancer, or whatever you want to call it, just working as, essentially, ultimately, most often just selling your time, right? that's fine. And you can have no employees. You can choose to make the step up where you start employing people, and it requires a different skill set, and you can start like getting to a different sort of scale, size, and so on. Doesn't need to be big though. You can have 1 or 2 employees, maybe some back-end staff that support you to do that. But it's still a choice about whether you want to take on that responsibility of being an employer. But
that isn't always the only option.
Yeah.
Like this is the thing that I think people think about, and what's surprising to them is they always think what I'm talking about usually in that scenario is that, and it's like, well, actually no, there's other ways of doing it. You can productize your knowledge. Knowledge is actually what's really valuable, So it's like, a great example of that is someone I'm working with at the moment who is a barber and wants to open their own place and stuff. I'm like, great. Have you thought about the future though? Because I know barbers. I've worked with them through Booksy for years, and they get to like 5 years, 8 years in their tenure as a barber. They have medical issues, every single one of them, back, neck, hands, all of them. And then they start thinking, shit, what have I done to plan? I'm not going to be able to cut the same amount of heads as I used to, et cetera, et cetera. So then it's like, okay, let's start thinking practically. How good are you? What is your specialty? Let's productize it. What about training? What about consultancy? What are you good at? Is it the business piece? Is it the creative piece? Like, that's the kind of stuff that I think people just don't think about. It's like, oh, actually, it's my knowledge. It's my skills that, that are equally as valuable. What can I do to that to safeguard my future and create a retirement fund? And it's a similar thing, I think, in what we do too, is that, well, as is evidenced by the amount of exited founders that go on to build venture studios or angel investors, become angel investors and build funds and become advisors. Like, we've got it a lot more maturely set up in some ways than a lot of other areas. So it's really kind of drawing from that and saying, hey, have some of this free stuff, but also and on this topic as well, like I've been very transparent about this with my team in regards to my own startup. We've been planning and building for years now, and really went to market beginning of this year and then announced our pre-seed a couple of weeks ago. And I've been very open and honest that I do not care at all if I'm the CEO in 3, 4, 8 years. What I care about is that we solve the problem we're setting out to solve. That is the most important thing. As long as that continues to happen with either me at the helm or someone else, I just want to see that problem in the world solved, because for me, it's that important. And it should be for all of us. It's like, it's not, take our egos out of it. It's not about us. It's about if we can deliver this to the world, we'll leave the world a better place than we found it. And I think that drives a lot of technologists.
I don't disagree, as I've often said, which is like, when people go, what do you.
If you are enjoying this episode and want to support the show, please like, subscribe with notifications turned on, and let us know your thoughts and opinions in the comments below. This lets YouTube know we are doing something right. Back to the show.
Why did you want to be a founder? And it's like, honestly, it's like this thing, it sounds so cliche, but truth is, I think pretty much any entrepreneur, the reason why they become an entrepreneur is because they want to change the world. And I use that somewhat more grandiose version of it, but it's essentially boils down to, I want to have an impact on the world, and it can be small or big, the scale's not the point, but it's like, I want to change the world and I want to change it in a positive light that I care about, right? And it's like solving that problem, right? And as you were talking about, that's what drives, that's the primary driver of everything. And I think for especially for me and actually all my friends who, are founders and entrepreneurs, money is never the motivator, right? It's this case of, I trust that we live in a collaborative society, and if I get this right and it works, like I'll make money, but like that's not why I'm choosing to do this. If anything, there's sort of this reality distortion field that some of them are even acknowledge, which is you want to go make this change in the world, somewhat against better judgment. Right? Like 75% of most early stage businesses don't make it beyond year 2. From that alone, you've got better odds going down to the casino, putting it all on red and spinning the roulette wheel.
Yeah,
right?
It's stupid.
So it's like, it's irrationally stupid. But you kind of, when you start out, there's this little piece of you, which is, and I think you need it, which is to someone ignore those stats. And it's not about being delusional about, you're so special and you're going to be in the 25%.
No, it's just determination.
It's more about you owe it to yourself to give it a go.
Right.
And it's sort of going, I don't want to wake up later down my life and not have tried,
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the big differences. It's like, at least for me, it's this pace of like, well, what's the worst going to happen? Now, I say that with a bit of maturity where I've luckily been fortunate enough where I didn't when I didn't know any better, I didn't actually take any stupidly huge risks. And then I became more advanced and more mature in my entrepreneurship to realize that the best entrepreneurs never risked it all. So what I mean to say is there's often this disconnect between the sort of Dragon's Den PR story of like entrepreneurship, which is like never give up, 99 no's, just keep going. And it's sort of like this
sleep on your friend's sofas if you have to, sell your children, like all of this
mortgage your house to the hill, this kind of stuff, like, steal, borrow money, sell your kidney, all of that stuff, just to like pursue your dream. And I think there's this element of that can actually be quite poisonous advice if it's not put in context of, well, hold on, you don't want to fall in the trap of madness, which is doing the same thing again and again, expecting a different outcome. That's madness, right? It's not quite the same thing as persistence. It's like, there's an element of like, you've got to be trying, like, have we tried it? That didn't work. What did we learn? How do we try something slightly different? And then eventually you're like 99 tries. It's like the Thomas Edison, how many goes does it take to create a light bulb? Well, like on the 10,000 iteration and we got it to work, scenario. That's slightly different versus doing the same thing again. So you want to avoid straight up madness. But there's also this piece where you want the bet to be asymmetric, which is all good investors know that you want to be looking at an asymmetric return, which is if this works, I make insane amount of upside. But if it doesn't work, I don't lose everything. So you want this ability to have multiple bites of the apple. So I try, if it doesn't work out, I'm still in the game, I'm not out the game, right? And that's really critical. So downside
you have a chance
protection,
to reset and try something else.
Downside protection is so important. And it took me some years to actually really internalize and understand that, which is, the reality distortion feels important to like go pursue these things. But you've always got to have this base understanding of like, I can't bet too big that I lose everything and I'm out, right? You don't want to be homeless with kids you can't feed. Right. That's bananas. That's just that. Like, you don't want to be taking those risks if you don't have sufficient evidence and data to support like the leap.
Yeah, that's exactly the premise as to why I give advice to someone 20 just straight out of uni, lives with their mum and dad, gets everything paid for. Their idea for a startup, and the advice I'm going to give them entirely different to someone like me, 40 with 2 kids, wife, mortgage. It's like you've got to make sure these basics are covered first. I mean, when you're in your 20s and you're in that situation, go and have fun. Break some shit.
I agree.
Yeah,
I agree. But that, I mean, those are the fun days. But it's like, what do you have to lose? Like time? But I've got an abundance of time. I'm in my 20s.
Well, you have just nothing but gains.
I don't need sleep either. I just
right, exactly. Yeah, and you don't get hangover and all of that.
Exactly.
Yeah, but you have nothing but to gain there, because if even as you fail,
also,
you're just going to gain.
There's a truth around that, which is like also you're maximizing for different things, which is at that stage of your career, you should be maximizing for rate of learning.
Yes.
Right. And it's rate of learning that's more important than anything else. Once you get later in life, if you actually have, so let me use this phrase. So it's a bit of a tangent, but it's kind of really, so a friend of mine was talking about, he used this phrase of there's 3 types of entrepreneurship. And I was like, 3 types? What are you talking about? This sounds interesting. Riddle me this. And he goes, type 1, he's like, look, there's essentially serial entrepreneurship, which is like, a founder builds one company, then he goes on to like it dies or he sells it, and he goes on to company 2, company 3, and often those companies are slightly different, right? So A, B, C. There's parallel entrepreneurship, which is kind of what I've been doing a lot of my life in the studio world, which is you're building multiple different businesses in parallel. And then there's repeat entrepreneurship, which is you basically build the same thing again and again. So like you're an e-com founder, you sell one thing, you go do another e-com business, you do another e-com business, you sell it. So like whether the first brand was like candles and the second brand is like, nutrition, doesn't really matter. It's an e-com business, right? And he was saying to me that if you look at serial, parallel, and repeat, it's like the mode that has the greatest probability of wealth creation over the long term, 10, 20, 30 year period, is by far repeat. And the reason why it's by far repeat is because of what he called compounding interest. Like we understand the concept of compounding interest to capital, but it works with everything else. It works with domain knowledge, reputation, network, like all of these things that if you spend 10, 15 years doing something, guess what? The shit gets a bit easier, right? Or the way I kind of describe it, it might not feel like it's getting any easier. Like it never gets any easier, but you do get a shit lot better.
Mm-hmm.
And so your probability of winning significantly increases. And that's that scenario where, you know, in your 20s or at the beginning, you're trying to sit there and say, how do I basically commit to compounding interest? How do I learn the most, build up skill sets, knowledge, credibility, network, you know, all of these things that over time, you know, because also in the beginning, it's like, you're not quite sure what your life mission. I mean, I never had a life mission, right? So I look back at these things where it's like, there's been this oscillation of try stuff out for a couple of years here and there to kind of iterate to what is like my flavor of
see preference. If it kind of revealed itself to you somewhat along
and
the
like,
way.
You know, you could sort of try it to figure it out. But like, if you really did have a mission that you wanted to pursue, then you could be way more targeted. You didn't necessarily need the exploration of trying loads of different things out. You could just go, right, how do I compound something? And therefore, in the beginning, it's just like, how do I basically get as much, you know, data in the bank that I can then, you know, earn interest on later down the line.
God, I envy people who are able to function like that. I'm the middle one. I'm the parallel one.
Yeah, parallels are really hard. I've spent my, you know, so this is the weird thing. I spent the vast majority of my career doing parallel entrepreneurship. Is intellectually, or at least for me, really, really rewarding because of the variety, right, and the challenge. And I think the reason why I was drawn to it is because the rate of learning was always vertical, because it'd be like, cool, you know, this year I'm learning, you know, I'm building a construction tech business in Texas. It's like, what? Next year I'm doing, you know, an earned wage access fintech business in the UK. And it's like, what the hell?
Yeah.
But I found it fascinating. And so for me, I always felt like I was learning. I always felt like I was like upskilling. And that always kept my energy levels high. But as much as I was always energized, truth is, I'm very confident I would have made way more wealth if I had not done that.
Yeah, right? Likewise.
And if I'd been more of a disciplined, you know, let's call it investment thesis. And the reason why I say investment thesis is, if you look at VC, the data is unquestionably clear on this, which is focused investment theses. So like, say, industry focused, like fintech, or, you know, business model focused, we only do B2B SaaS. Those focused investment theses always outperform generalist theses.
Yeah.
Right? And the truth is, it's the same concept with the studio, in the sense that when you're doing, whether it's investment for or building, you know, startup for, you would hope you're getting better at it because the previous experiences are adding to your journey. And I think for me, that is like, they've been adding to the rich tapestry of my life, Greg. But I wouldn't say all of them have been like a linear multiplication of like what I'm doing. You know, I think there's quite a few years where I'm like, I know some weird stuff about nappy bags because I got into
Well, it's a bit like my mentioning of barbershops earlier. I was like, that isn't useful apart from in conversation. Like, really, but, you know. But yeah, I totally agree. Yeah.
But like, honestly, I've got so many of these things. Like my first ever startup wasn't really Actually, my first business was in the hardware business. So I did a children's pushchair.
Right. Okay.
So it's like basically sort of before Bugaboo, but we were trying to do like a premium pushchair. And I did engineering at university, so I ended up going to like China. It's like weird ass stories of like being in factories in China trying to produce like hardware. But like, it's so bizarre because that was like in my mid-20s. I found myself in that industry, which is called the nursery industry, and going to like trade shows like Kind and Jugend in Cologne, and like big children's trade fair. But like knowing weird shit about like breast pumps and nappy bags and like safety regulations on like, you know, seat warmers and stuff like this, and like car seats.
Yeah, but I bet it makes you very formidable in like a pub quiz. You know,
it's never come up, Greg. It's never come up. Nothing in that industry. But like, it's so bizarre. And it was also bizarre because even at the time when I was building that business, I kind of got a lot of stick because A, I was a dude, and B, I wasn't a parent at the time.
Right.
And so it was like, and it is, and I don't mean this disparaging, but a lot of businesses in that sector, especially the SME side, typically ex-parents. So like typically I'd call them mompreneurs, you know, sort of, they fall in love with it, they see a problem, they want to develop a product. And there's a lot of those sort of mompreneur type businesses, which is fantastic, by the way. But
it's what you see in most industries. I mean, you see people who have experienced the problem entering into it to solve it, right?
So then there was a little bit of like, well, you haven't experienced this, why would I talk to you?
Right. Yeah.
And I was like, I think my business is more successful than yours. So, but anyway, but like, weird. It was just a weird thing. Like I spent, quite a few years of my life doing that, and then have never come back to it. It's like gone.
Yeah, but no, I totally sympathize. I think by the sounds of it, you've got a similar sort of personality to mine, where it's just if you find something interesting, you just dive into it, and you can sometimes get lost into it a little.
I'm a lot better at this. I don't do it as much.
I'm trying to be as well. I mean, especially now that I run a startup. I mean, this is why it's taken me so long actually to come up with to take the plunge and become the founder and CEO of a tech startup. There's been plenty of opportunities, plenty of ideas, plenty of people that have said we could become co-founders, this, that, and the other. And I've known for, this trait of mine, number one, like, am I going to get distracted by other things? Can I stay fully focused? But also, is the problem meaty enough? Because if I'm going to go into it, it has to be. And this one was the one, fortunately. But I'm aware of that. But now being the founder of this,
so
okay, be a bit more relentless with these. Okay, this is interesting. Okay, stop. Like last night, I started writing something like a brand new idea, and I was like, stop. Come back to this one once you've exited peer. You know what I mean? This business. So,
and was it organic for you coming across Pierre, or what was
it was actually yeah. So it was from meeting someone who was looking for advice initially. We started talking, started working on his business, and then the possibilities of it started sort of. Really, it was something that he had never saw initially with an initial version of the business model and the product, and then it kind of evolved. And we're like, actually, we could do something quite majorly disruptive here. What do you think of this idea? But if we were to do this, can we join forces? And and then that's where it was kind of born. So yeah, it was pretty organic. It was over a period of a couple of years working on it and seeing like, can we prove that this has legs? And then doing the old thing, speaking to a bunch of experts and doing what you can to get feedback on it. And
not many people do that, annoyingly. Weirdly, Greg, this is one of the things that I get a bit frustrated with first-time founders, is they don't. I'm being a bit generalist, but in my experience, too few spend enough effort in trying to find people who've done this before or had experience, like real experts, to go pick their brains. It's
pretty much the reason for this show. To be honest, I mean, I've always been quite transparent about the reason for this show. It's pretty selfish. There's two reasons. It's because it's to combat my potential loneliness that grows sitting in a garden office on my own day in, day out, and not interacting with humans beyond a very transactional sort of thing. Like, we've got a 30-minute meeting, we need to do this. It's like to have actual conversations. So it's very selfish in that regard. But then the other side of it is meeting interesting people, meeting people who are smarter than me, who know more than me about navigating this space of being a founder, being an investor, like all these things. It's, I absorb it. I'm trying to be like a sponge. And I think that's the only way I can get better as a founder and CEO, is speaking to other people that have done it and been there, understanding their philosophies, not necessarily agreeing with everything, but like, that's how you just get better as a person, let alone as a founder, or a parent or whatever. It's like, we've just talk.
Yeah. Being the perpetual student.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Student of the game. 100%.
Yeah. And it's just highly entertaining. I love conversation. It's just, hopefully it's entertaining for the people I speak to as well. But time will tell. but on that note, actually, we've come to the end of part one already. I just glanced down and noticed it goes pretty damn quick. So in part two, I do want to ask about kind of what's lying ahead for you, because if you're saying that you're kind of reassessing stuff, so we'll get to that. But for those listening and watching, thank you, and come back in a couple of days. Subscribe, all that crap, so you get notified when the next part comes out. Soon. So that's the end of part one. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you for listening and/or watching. Subscribe with notifications turned on to get notified when part 2 comes out. While you wait, please join in the conversation in the comments below.